Hey, folks, one more announcement, and I apologize. We're going to take one more 5-minute delay. So we've moved to 11:25 now. Thank you so much. Hey, folks, I just wanted to make the announcement to give a little insight on what's going on. We're having some issues with Dashboard, and that's the system we use for everyone to see the amendments and the bills that are out there. So, in light of being transparent and everybody knows what's going on, we're waiting on Dashboard to come back online. It should be up in the next 2 or 3 minutes. So that's been the cause for the delay. So I just want to let everybody know. Thanks. All right. Another update here for the members and the folks that are out here to see this committee meet today. Our dashboard's still not up, and anything's neither on the portal either, so nobody will be able to see anything online. We're working on getting some copies made, members, for the calendar and whatever amendments that we have, so we can see those. We'll need those before we can move forward. So if everybody can just continue to be patient, and I don't want to give a set time, I don't want to jinx it again. So if everybody could just kind of hang tight, and we'll get started just as soon as we have what we need to move forward. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, members, and everyone in the audience. Really appreciate that. We had some issues with dashboard and our portal. Ended up making copies, and as we just hit refresh, members' dashboard is up now. So with that said, Madam Clerk, if we can go ahead and call the roll.
Representatives Carr, Carringer, Cooper, Darby, Eldridge, Faison, Hall,
Here.
Hodges, Howell, Hulsey, Johnson, Lamberth, Potts, Rudder, Sherrill, Thompson, Todd, Warner, Zachary, Vice Chairman Grills, Chairman Farmer.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to welcome everyone to the COVID-19 committee of this third extraordinary session of the Tennessee General Assembly. Members, does anyone have any personal orders or anyone that they'd like to recognize before we get started? I know everyone's ready to get started. Okay, that sounds good. I've got a couple announcements before we get started with regards to the calendar. We have 5 bills that's been asked by the sponsors to be taken off of notice, okay? So that'll be item 31, House Bill 9059. That's been requested to be taken off notice and without objection. House Bill 9059 is off notice. Also, item 32, House Bill 9040 has been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Any objection? Seeing none. That bill's off notice. Item 33, House Bill 9041, has been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Any objection, members? Seeing none. House Bill 9041, off notice. Item 35, House Bill 9054, has been requested to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Any objection? Seeing none. Off notice. Also, item 40, House Bill 9030, has been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Any objection, members? Seeing none. Off notice. And that brings us back to item number 1 on our calendar. That's House Bill 9077 by Chairman Zachary. I've got a motion. I got a second. Mr. Chairman, you're properly recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a total of 3 amendments. Drafting Code 10275.
I got a motion, got a second. I got a motion, and a second. Members, do we have any objection to adopting this amendment? Seeing none. Amendment's adopted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an additional amendment, which is Drafting Code 10307.
Seeing none, any objections? Seeing none. Amendment's adopted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And then finally, Drafting Code 10310.
Got a motion, got a second on that amendment. Okay, seeing no objection, we're going to adopt that amendment. Thank you. And just a housekeeping matter, did we get a motion and a second on the bill? I think we did. Yes, we did. This is not motion and a second, so we're properly on the bill as amended at this point in time. Without objection, I'm going to roll all those 3 amendments into one. Members, seeing none. Just going to roll all those amendments into one. And Mr. Chairman, if you would, you can go ahead and talk about that piece of legislation.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Members, but before I get into the bill, I typically don't do this, but because of the importance of this and the impact on our state, I have a prepared statement that I'm going to read, and then I'll go through the bill and then be glad to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman, if that's good with you.
You're recognized.
Thank you. Members, COVID has had a significant impact on all of us. Many of us have had the virus. We have family members that have had the virus. Some of us have family members that have had hospital stays. We know those, unfortunately, who have lost their lives because of COVID. It's had a significant impact on our state from Memphis to Mountain City. Over the last 19 months, we have taken extraordinary measures, extraordinary steps to protect the most vulnerable, to protect our population from COVID. Unfortunately, in taking those steps, government has moved outside the bounds of the Constitution. The Constitution, the federal and state constitution are still the government governing documents of this land. And those documents make clear that government's responsibility is to maintain a framework of ordered liberty. Over the last 19 months, government has overstepped those bounds and the guardrails that have been set forth by our founders in the Constitution. Even in the face of a health crisis, freedom, individual liberty, and the unalienable rights that are granted us by God must be defended, preserved, and protected. Ronald Reagan said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed down for them to do the same. Over the last 19 months, what we have experienced has been unprecedented. We were here in March of 2020 when the world basically came to a stop. And before I get fact checked by whomever, as I walk through this list, this is probably not in the correct order, but you'll understand the point. We entered in March of 2020. We entered 15 days to flatten the curve. Some would say we're 19 months into 15 days to flatten the curve. Safer at home orders were issued. We had to stay home because we didn't have enough PPP. Then we had to stay home because we didn't have enough ventilators. Businesses in our state were deemed essential and non-essential by the government. Non-essential businesses were closed by the government. And I can tell you as a business owner, every business is essential. Everyone has a reliance on every business to provide for their families. Schools were closed. Many didn't reopen until the fall of 2020. And many of those schools that did open had significant safety measures placed on the children that attended. A vaccine was introduced at the end of 2020, which was supposed to restore our way of life. Instead of restoring normalcy moving through 2021, the vaccine and fear surrounding the virus led to vaccine passports, even though on August 5th, the CDC director made clear that the vaccine does not stop transmission. More people died from COVID in August, September, and October of this year than they did August and September and October of last year. Now the Biden administration has taken a full step toward authoritarianism by weaponizing the free market against the people of this country by issuing orders that federal contractors must require their employees to be vaccinated, costing thousands of Tennesseans their job. On social media last week, I asked for those stories to be sent to me. In a 4-day period, I received 1,200 emails from people from Memphis to Mountain City that are losing their job. Roughly half of them work for federal contractors. The other half did not. This is having a significant impact on the people of our state. I need to remind you, too, that no executive order has been issued and OSHA has not yet issued a rule. Yet many companies who are not federal contractors have begun to mandate the vaccine, taking away Tennesseans' ability to work and provide for their family because they will not take a vaccine. And in many cases, as I received in these emails, not taking into account a religious exemption, a right of conscience exemption, or those who have had the COVID virus. Just this week, just a couple of days ago, actually, Pfizer announced that they have approved the vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds. According to the CDC numbers, Mr. Chairman, the survivability rate of those 0 to 17 is 99.998%. The infection fatality rate for those 0 to 17 is 0.002%. In Knox County, which is the county I'm in 19 months, we've had 49 children hospitalized, 0 deaths. I know that's not the same for every county. I understand that completely. 49 children hospitalized in 19 months with 0 deaths. And according to the people at Children's Hospital, 80% of those children that were hospitalized had some kind of comorbidity. Mr. Chairman, there is no data or science that supports vaccinating children with an mRNA vaccine in the way that we are vaccinating now, which has never been done in history. The Biden administration has already told the governors on a call a few weeks ago that they plan on mandating this in schools. On Sunday night, and I have this on my Twitter feed for anybody who would like to see, Dr. Harvey Risch, who is a Yale epidemiologist and someone who has been cited over 40,000 times, making him one of the most cited epidemiologists in the country, said, and I quote, "If it were my child and this was mandated, I would homeschool them. There is no choice. Your child's life is on the line." And again, you want to look at, jump on my Twitter feed and you can see the quote. So the question then becomes, Mr. Chairman, where does this stop? We have been in this roller coaster for 19 months, and that is not to minimize this in any way. I too have people that I know that have passed away from COVID. Does not minimize that in any way. But we have a responsibility to maintain a framework of ordered liberty as government. And I'm going to close this with this, Mr. Chairman, before I present the bill. In thinking through this presentation, I kept going back to something that was written by C.S. Lewis. Of all the tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better for us to live under robber barons than omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make hell on earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which may not regard as a disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, is to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. So, Mr. Chairman, just quickly in closing, the federal government, again, has completely overstepped the bounds of the Constitution. This has become about coercion and control. This is not about science. This is not about listening to the experts. Masked, forced vaccines, vaccinating children, the coming order to vaccinate children in school who are almost at no risk for COVID. The actions of our federal government will strip us and have stripped us of our bodily autonomy, which strips us of our individual liberty. The Constitution is still the rule of law in this land. The state constitution, even beyond the federal, references the protection of the right of conscience and liberty, which each of us took an oath to defend. This only stops when we make it stop. Government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And the vast majority of Tennessee, based on the makeup of this body, the vast majority of Tennesseans do not consent to where we stand today. And so, Mr. Chairman, what I'm about to present to you is on behalf of the people that we represent, and it was on behalf of the Constitution, both the state and the federal. And so, Mr. Chairman, now moving into the bill, it's an extensive bill. I'm going to quickly go through the bill, be glad to answer any questions. But I'll kind of walk through the bill.
If I may, real quick,
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to let the members know, and mostly the public, that out of the three amendments we adopted, the first one was Amendment 010275. That makes the bill. That's the substantive portion of the bill. The other two amendments we adopted were some technical corrections and some cleanup. So I did want to make that clear. We kind of moved that through that quickly. I was excited to get started. We were running a little bit late, but I apologize for interrupting you. Just want to let everybody know where we were and what we did.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the two additional amendments were just cleanups. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, members, moving into the bill. House Bill 9077. This bill creates a new section of code, Title 14, which is the section related to all things COVID-19. So as we kind of walk through this, just remember that this particular code is a new section of code in 14, and everything related to what we're going to discuss is COVID-19, because typically after a presentation like this, we'll start getting all these questions about whatever this may apply to. This only applies to COVID-19. If you look through the first 5 pages of the bill, it is simply definitions to provide clarity. And so I'll spare you reading 5 pages of definitions because you were kind enough to listen to my opening remarks. So you can go through those. The first page is just definition. Let me move into the substance of the bill. In section 14.1.104, it makes clear that the governor, no governmental entity or official can suspend anything within Title 14, even under a state of emergency. This particular section of code is protected if passed, become law, and this is not eligible, or a state of emergency is not applicable in any suspension of this. 14.2.102, which is the first substantive section of the code, bans the requirement to show proof of vaccination, period, across the board. Never, I thought in this country, would we have to show our papers for entry or access to anything. But many of us have been asked to show our papers over the last couple of weeks for entry and access to services. Some of us have gone to buildings that we paid for as taxpayers specifically and been asked to show those papers. This takes care of all of it across the board. Employees, governmental entities, which we've already covered, businesses. It's completely covered in this. No one can require you in the state of Tennessee, if this becomes law, to show you proof of vaccination. Just like people don't ask you for your flu vaccination, for your polio vaccination, for whatever it may be, it'll be the same thing for COVID-19. Section 14.2.102 is a ban on mask, a prohibition on mask, period, across the board. There are some exceptions related to severe conditions. And in those severe conditions, that does include if we are in a state of emergency. Other conditions must be met within those severe conditions. And if a mask mandate is issued and it does meet the criteria, it can only be for a 14-day period.
And that's under section 14.2.103, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Did I say 102, Mr. Chairman?
Maybe, but just want to make that clear.
Yep. Yes, sir. 14.2.103. Thank you. Yes. In section 14.2.104, it's the section related to schools, talks about face covering in schools. It provides certain exemptions for schools, but it will be on a school by school basis. It cannot be LEA. It cannot be countywide. The principal can petition the LEA if the severe conditions are met. That can be the exemption can then be granted to the school. We also move into that, and that 14-day period does apply. We also move into reasonable accommodations where an individual principal can grant certain exemptions. And then we also reference the ADA in here and what can be done and the reasonable accommodations that can be met for any ADA student. Moving on, Mr. Chairman. Make sure I've got my numbers right here. 14.3.101 addresses unemployment. Those who are fired because they will not get the vaccine. Those who have left their job because they will not get the vaccine will be eligible for unemployment. 14.4.102 deals with monoclonal antibodies. A couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, I guess now, it has been the federal government changed a process that was working really well. They inserted the state in between those ordering and the federal government. So they inserted and made it a more cumbersome process. When that happened, guidance was issued from our state that was actually NIH guidance. It was not state guidance. They simply provided NIH guidance regarding what could have been rationing or favoritism with how those monoclonal antibodies are distributed. This makes clear that it is up to the doctor. It is up to the doctor to, in his discretion, to administer the monoclonal antibodies, notwithstanding any guidance or advice received from any kind of governmental entity. We're going to let the doctor and the patient manage that relationship, and the doctor will then determine who is the best fit for monoclonal antibodies and who is in the most at need. Section 14.4.103 references the mature minor doctrine, which is probably something I've gotten more calls and emails about than just about anything over the last couple of months. Again, please keep in mind this is related to COVID-19. This does require, moving forward, this will require the doctor to receive written notification for any minor who wants the COVID-19 vaccine. It does make an exception for abuse or neglect, and that's at the doctor's discretion. 14.5.101, Mr. Chairman, that is the language that we have already passed related to COVID liability protection. So we simply took the language that we passed, I guess, last summer. It takes that language and moves that into this section to ensure that everything related to COVID is in this section. Moving into 14.6.101, that's the anti-commandeering clause. This makes clear that public funds of this state or any political subdivision of this state shall not be allocated for the implementation, regulation, enforcement of any federal law, executive order, rule, regulation, or mandate administered for COVID-19 countermeasures. Personnel or property of this state, any governmental entity, shall not be allocated for the implementation of any federal law, federal rule related to COVID-19. Moving into 14.6.102, one of the challenges, and I referenced it in my opening remarks, one of the challenges we have faced, especially in Knox County, where I represent so many people that work at the Oak Ridge National Lab, the federal contractors have, many of them, some of the date has already passed, but many of them, all of them, are at risk of their federal contracts if they don't require their employees to be vaccinated. And so we recognize that. And so we have made exemptions in an appeal process, a very broad appeal process related to those who would be at loss for federal funds with this law that we would pass. And so it provides them certain exemptions that goes through the commissioner of F&A. It provides the parameters of that, but anyone who would need an exemption because of a loss of federal dollars, this provides them the avenue to be able to do that. 14.6.103 is a right of action. If there is a violation of Chapter 2, it provides you a right of action against the entity that did not honor state law. And then lastly, Mr. Chairman, Section 13 is a severability clause. There's no doubt there will be litigation that will follow a sweeping bill that will be the first of its kind in the nation. No doubt there'll be litigation that will follow the passing of this law, the passing of this legislation. And so this provides a severability clause to ensure the integrity of various aspects of the bill from those that may be struck down in any court of law. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I have hit all the high points. Unless you want me to read the 5 pages of definitions, which I'll be glad to start doing now, I think I'll rest for questions.
I think you've done a wonderful job explaining that. You've got us to the point to where I think it's time that we can allow members to start asking a few questions. I think you probably end up referencing some of those definitions and some of the questions that may or may not be asked this afternoon. So first on my list, I have Leader Lambert. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a general statement, and thank you for the good explanation of this bill, especially given the technology issues that were earlier. I think it's important to make sure that we take our time. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership in that. So this is fully debated and really evaluated by everyone. But, over the last, especially several weeks, it seemed for whatever reason, there are a lot of businesses that have ramped up vaccine requirements. And I've tried very hard to talk to as many doctors as I can, and immunologists and epidemiologists, to see how effective a vaccine mandate within a workplace is in keeping employees within that workplace safe and guests and customers safe, because that's really what that should be about. I mean, if you're going to do any kind of a mandate. Now, our president went out and jumped the gun and just decided to announce that they were going to do a mandate on employers 100 and above. And I noticed that has taken a lot longer for OSHA to actually send out the guidelines on that, because that's not the way this should be done. We're doing what Congress should be doing and what our federal counterparts should be doing right now, going through the legislative process, coming into special session, listening to all the folks that are in this room that have emailed, called, and sent messages to us so that we can actually debate this and hopefully put this in the law. When we first began discussing whether or not to have a bill of this nature, I'll admit, and I think several of us will admit, that we had some reservations about putting some policy guidelines statewide on what businesses can't do. Because we're not requiring businesses to do anything. The feds are trying to do that. We're doing the opposite. We're trying to say, look, in our state, here's a policy of what you can't do. And as evaluating that and listening to my constituents in Sumner County, I heard from nurses, I heard from doctors, I heard from factory workers, I heard from folks from all walks of life that work in lots of different businesses. But the emails that I got from nurses really struck home with me. These are nurses that for the better part of 2 years have been our healthcare heroes, and they have worked diligently. And I've toured the COVID unit at our local hospital. They were kind enough to bring me over and show me just how difficult it is for them to care for COVID patients. And by the way, for anybody out there that's listening that thinks COVID isn't an absolutely horrendous disease, go look at somebody that's actually battling this disease. It's horrible, okay? Talk to your doctor. If you choose to be vaccinated, do so. But if you choose not to be, that's your choice. That's all we're doing in the policy here. And we're protecting those nurses and other medical professionals the best that we can at the state level who have lived this for almost 2 years. We've all stood up and applauded. We've all thanked them. We bought them lunches and we've said, thank you for taking care of my aunt, my uncle, my mom, my dad, my child. But now at this point, for their employer to say, well, you spent 2 years in a COVID unit battling this and risking your own life, but if you don't get the vaccine, we're going to fire you. That's just wrong. And so I just wanted to say kind of at the beginning of this, how at least for me and my vote, how I've come to the point where I support this piece of legislation fully, is it's because of those employees that are out there that are working at businesses like the gentleman that I talked to yesterday, who's been at the same business for 30 years. He comes into work. He goes into a control room in a factory. He doesn't interact with anybody all day long. He sits in a control room and he brings his lunch, is what he told me, and is in that control room from the time he clocks in to the time he clocks out. He's not a real social guy. He said, look, man, I go in, I do my job, and I go home. What would the possible utility to the company be to fire him? To do what? I mean, it's his choice as to whether or not to get the vaccine. I mean, the science we have right now, it does reduce many of the symptoms if you don't have an adverse reaction. But everybody's health is different. Every situation is different. From my understanding, and one of the doctors I talked to just a couple of weeks ago, if you are recovering from COVID, doctors are encouraging folks to at least wait a little time after you've recovered from COVID before you are vaccinated. Do we just fire those people that have just recovered from this thing and haven't yet gotten doctor's clearance to get a vaccine? I have a close family member of mine, and I'll butcher the pronunciation of this, but he has Guillain-Barré syndrome. And it's relatively rare, but his doctors waited 8 months with consultation with him to finally clear him to be vaccinated. Is he just supposed to go without pay for 8 months because his doctors tell him, hey, we don't know enough yet for you to take this. It may be dangerous for you. Now, that family member eventually was vaccinated. It turned out fine for him, okay? But he waited for his doctor to tell him it was okay. I just wanted to share that. I know you've been battling this battle for a long time. Thank you. Thank the speaker and others for bringing this legislation forward. But that's why we're here today, is to debate these issues and hopefully find a way that we can thread the needle between having a robust economic engine in this state and all of our businesses having a really, really, really good chance to both grow and thrive here, but not to take out some agenda set forth by some politician in D.C. on our citizens here in Tennessee. Let's get through this thing together. And the last thing I'll say on this, and this is more just kind of on my heart beyond the bill, have a little grace with one another, show a little Tennessee love for each other. If you feel strongly that you need to be vaccinated and it is your mission to preach that to everybody you know, do that in a loving way. Meet folks where they are and understand that there may be people that disagree with that. Don't hate those folks. Don't yell at those folks. Don't get on Facebook and act like those folks are evil. And the converse is exactly the same. If you feel very, very, very strongly against being vaccinated and you have friends and relatives and loved ones or just strangers that you don't know on social media, don't yell and scream and curse and holler at them because of their decision. Respect their decision for what it is too. I hope over the next few days or weeks or however long this takes, that we can manage to navigate that well. Thank you for bringing the bill, and I just wanted to share that at the beginning here.
And thank you for that, Leader Lambert. Chairman Zachary, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Leader, for the comments. And I think you bring up a really important point. In talking to Covenant Health, Children's Hospital, UT, which are in Knox County, Representative Carriger and I have talked to them many times. And I think the consistent theme has been, how can these actions be about healthcare and protecting people when a pending OSHA rule will literally cripple the healthcare system? If you talk to the team at Covenant, you talk to the team at UT, projections, they could lose up to 20 to 30% of their workforce, who is already, to your point, Leader, beyond taxed. They have already worked through COVID. Many of them have recovered. Many of them are vaccinated. They knew the risk and they worked through that when there was no vaccine. Now there is a vaccine and it should be their choice whether they get it or not. And if the federal government, if the Biden administration is about health and the well-being of the people in our communities, a rule like that would cripple the healthcare system, not just in Knox County, but every county across our state. They're beyond short-staffed. And so it's important that we remember that. But with that being said, the reality is these facilities cannot operate without the funding that comes through CMS. And so I think it is important that I do note, Mr. Chairman, that on page 415, section 15B, it makes an exemption for those related to CMS. Now, it's only if that ruling, only if it's not a ruling from CMS, whatever the proper term would be. Let's see, participation imposes a requirement contrary to the title, enforceable Medicaid conditions. It's not a rule from CMS, but if CMS takes action and issues some sort of requirement for vaccination, we have taken steps to make those who receive those resources from CMS exempt. Because again, that would cripple the healthcare system. And so we are aware of that, and that's a reality. And to your point, the OSHA rule may or may not be coming, but if CMS does act, then we've prepared for that in this legislation.
Thank you. Leader Lamberth, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the sponsor. And I know you've got a lot of sections. It's a big bill. The one I was looking at was 146102, exemptions due to potential loss of federal funding. And it's important. And I would hope, again, that our federal counterparts would see what we do here and give both businesses and individual the flexibility to make a decision on their own. And as time goes by, I think they will find that every Tennessean and every American can make wise decisions so that we can all continue to battle this pandemic together, not being forced by our government into a specific decision, but that we can continue to do this together. But I think it's 146102 subsection A that will preserve federal funding since the feds have put our businesses and a lot of our employers and schools in a really tough spot where even against their own wishes, they don't want to lose federal funding and contracts and everything else that they've been doing that include cancer research and education and, Oak Ridge National Labs. I mean, you can go on and on and on, but I mean, that's important for us to have that shared investment there, but I think that preserves it, that section.
Chairman Zachary, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Leader, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So 146102 deals with federal contracts. And so we wanted to ensure that back on page 4 within the definitions, we included those who receive funding from CMS and make sure that we differentiated between the two and provide absolute clarity. So that way as we move forward with this bill, our healthcare providers would have security with some of the ambiguity related to them in 146102. We just wanted to make that clear in section 4. So thank you.
Leader Lamberth, any follow-up? Thank you. Members, anyone have any questions or comments for our sponsor? Well, excuse me. Okay, I have Chairman Howe on the list. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman, for this bill. I particularly would like to address 142103 having to do with the mask mandates. There's some things about the current climate in this country and in some parts of the states that have really troubled me. And I think I speak for my constituents who have communicated very effectively to me that they are against the mask mandates. But some things have brought this into focus for me. Remember last weekend, you may remember they had a little football game about 6 blocks from here, and it was about 70,000 people in the stands. And as the camera panned, the crowd couldn't find anybody wearing a mask. And the Saturday before that, there was 102,000 at Neyland Stadium. Same situation. Nobody wearing a mask. And you multiply that times the 14 schools that are in the SEC, not counting the Big 10, the Pac-10, and the Big 12, all the other schools, and you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who are attending these football games every weekend, and nobody's wearing a mask. And I was just glancing around the room here, and I think I've counted, it's a moving target, but 3 to 5 people who are wearing a mask out of a room of about 100. So clearly, this is not a concern. Wearing a mask is not a concern for the majority of Tennesseans. So I don't know, I just don't know why removing the authority of a local school board to mandate students wearing a mask is considered such a terrible thing, unless there's another agenda that I'm not aware of, because clearly it's not a risk to their health, because as you stated earlier, ages birth to 19, they're in the 0.002% of the risk category. So why are we doing this? Why are people in the media and certain agencies are saying it's important, we've got to have our kids in our schools wearing a mask? Well, tell me why, when no one else in society in Tennessee seems concerned about it. What's the agenda? I don't know what it is, but I know what they're selling I'm not buying. And I appreciate your bill, and I look forward to voting for it.
Thank you, Chairman Howe. Representative Zachary, you have any follow-up? All right, next on the list, I have Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do echo the sentiments of my colleagues with thanks and gratitude to our healthcare workers that have really put it all on the line, many of which I know personally and have gotten their individual stories over the last 18 months or so of what they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And putting them in a position and having our federal government especially put them in a position to make difficult choices like this that is really a personal health decision is just abhorrent to me. And certainly we need to do all we can to push back on that overreach of our federal government. I did want to say that I had 3 bills that I'm not running that I had filed that because I'm not running them because they're actually dealt with in this legislation. This is a very good, comprehensive piece of legislation that I plan to support. And I thank you for the way it's crafted, the different pieces of the concerns that our citizens have had being answered in this. So thank you, Mr. Sponsor.
Chairman Zachary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Todd. Members, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize and thank Speaker Sexton for his leadership. And I mean that with all sincerity. Speaker Sexton has led boldly over the last couple of weeks on behalf of all Tennesseans, and we have worn him out, and he has answered the call, and he has taken the best of everything that we filed and encompassed it in one bill. And so we can't overlook that. People of the state can't overlook that. He has been a defender and recognized the plight of Tennesseans and has stepped up to the call, and so I appreciate him being able to do that. And just quickly, Chairman Todd, it is important for us to remember in Federalist 45, James Madison wrote, "The powers provided by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. The powers provided by the Constitution to the states are numerous and indefinite." The Constitution places significant limits on the federal, the Constitution tells the federal government what it can do. The state Constitution tells us and puts limits around us because we have enormous flexibility in our police powers, the things that we can do as a state. That's why every state's different. That's why the power should rest with the states. That's why the founders intended the power to rest with the states. We've simply allowed that to be flipped upside down. It's important to remember the federal government has a new Congress, the executive branch, judiciary branch, Article 1, 2, and 3. Article 1, Senate's 1, all legislative power rests with Congress. I think Leader Lambert referenced that. If this is something we're going through where Congress has passed a bill, man, it's a completely different conversation. But the executive branch, under all administrations, has gotten to the point where they lead through executive order. The next administration comes in and does away with the executive order. The dysfunction in Washington is so broken in Washington, D.C., we have to ensure that we are doing all we can with the numerous indefinite powers that are provided to us through the federal Constitution. We have to ensure we do all we can to protect the people of the state. Our state is thriving. Look at what our state has accomplished and what has happened over the last 10 years. And I mean, the stark reality is, if you don't like the freedom that you have in Tennessee, man, you got 49 other states that you can pack your stuff up and move to. But I can't speak for you, but by God speaking for me, I didn't come up here just to vote and just kind of, man, things are great. When things like this happen, this is when we have to lead and we have to step up on behalf of Tennesseans. And that's what we're doing today. And I think we take that oath that we took very, very seriously, or otherwise we wouldn't be here. And so I appreciate your comments, Chairman Todd.
Very good. Next on the list, I have Chairman Carr. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Zachary, I don't mean to put you on the spot. It's just been a couple questions that have come up. And if we don't know the answer now, we may search them between now. It goes through the next committee. Number one for the question would be, do you think that this will affect our unemployment trust fund in any way?
Chairman Zachary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, we've talked with, actually, Chairman Reagan's not on this committee, is he? Hey, there's Chairman Reagan. So Chairman Reagan actually had an amendment on a bill we passed last week to bring clarity to that. So, and if I'm not mistaken, Chairman Reagan, the Department of Labor testified that we can provide this now. We just simply need to provide clarity within this legislation. So we can actually do this now. We're just making it clear we can do it.
Very good. Chairman Carr, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One more question, and then this is just for clarification.
Is this a hard question?
No, it's not hard, okay?
True or false?
Well, I don't know. I'll take that back. I'll see. Multiple choice. I guess we're talking about, is there an exception for healthcare workers that have already been exposed to COVID or had COVID?
Chairman Zachary, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's not referenced in this bill. No, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Farmer.
Thank you. Members, any other questions? All right, question's been called on the bill. Any objection? Seeing none, looks like we're voting to send House Bill 9077 to calendar and rules. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. No. Ayes have it. Bill moves on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to take a 10-minute recess. Thank you. All right, thank you everyone for your patience. Let's go ahead and resume our meeting. We left off after we passed House Bill 977, and that was item number 1. That bill moved to calendar and rules. That brings us to item 2 on our calendar. That's House Bill 9078 by Sexton, Chairman Sexton there, Speaker Sexton, actually. And we're going to move that to the Hill of Today's calendar without objection, the Hill of Today's calendar. That brings us to, let me go ahead and make a couple of cleanup announcements here as well. So we have a few matters that's going to be taken off notice. So that includes item number 7. House Bill 9050 has asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Any objection? Seeing none, that will be taken off notice. Item number 5, bouncing back, and I apologize. House Bill 9044. The sponsor has asked for that bill to be taken off notice. Members, do we have any objection to that? Seeing none, off notice. Item 6, House Bill 9048 has also been requested to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Any objection, members? Seeing none. Item number 27, House Bill 9062 has also been asked by the sponsor to be taken off notice. Members, any objection? Seeing none. Item number 28, House Bill 9063 has also been requested to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Members, do we have any objection to that? Seeing none. Item number 29, House Bill 9064 has also been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Members, do we have any objection? Seeing none. Item number 29 has also been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. That's House Bill 9064. Any objection? Seeing none. And rolling back to item 10, and I apologize, item 10, House Bill 9001 has been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Seeing no objection, off notice. Also, item 11, House Bill 9006 has been requested to be taken off notice. I don't see any objection to that. And I apologize for this, but item 20, House Bill 9011 has been asked to be taken off notice by the sponsor. Members, any objection to that? Seeing none. Now, with that said, that brings us to item 3 on our calendar, which is HJR 9005 by Chairman Reagan. Members, do I have a motion and a second? Chairman Reagan, you have a motion and a second. You're properly recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Committee members, I'm going to offer a brief apology because this is indeed a history-making piece of legislation. Consequently, it's going to be necessary for me to ensure that legislative intent is clearly spelled out. Therefore, I will be reading the entire resolution to you in addition to comments. Again, it is essential because, quite frankly, this is going to wind up in court the minute we pass it. Having said that, let me set the stage for you. Our own U.S. Constitution preamble says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." Ladies and gentlemen, this is the supreme law of the land, and in particular, I'll call your attention to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. A colleague of mine and ours that stood up here before hit those points rather hard, so I will not hit them again, except to say, as the supreme law of the land, please allow me to read the U.S. Constitution 10th Amendment to you. Again, this is for establishing legislative intent. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Again, establishing legislative intent. The Tennessee Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, labeled the doctrine of non-resistance. That government being instituted for the common benefit, the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. Also, from the Tennessee Constitution, Article 1, excerpt from Section 3, that no human authority can, in any case whatsoever, control or interfere with the rights of conscience. Now, to establish some further legislative intent, I will quote from a document published by the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health, April 21. The fetal cell lines being used to produce some of the potential COVID-19 vaccines are from two sources. HEK 293, a kidney cell that was isolated from a fetus in 1973 of undisclosed origin from either spontaneous miscarriage or an elective abortion. PER C6, a retinal cell line that was isolated from an aborted fetus in 1985. In the various stages of vaccine development and manufacturing, some of the COVID-19 vaccines used cells originally isolated from fetal tissue, often referred to as fetal cells. The use of fetal cell lines is a very sensitive and important topic within some faith communities and among individuals with concerns about the ethics of using materials derived in this way. That was from the Los Angeles County Health Department. Please note, ladies and gentlemen, again, to establish legislative intent. Like you, I have received literally thousands of emails, phone calls, face-to-face, I won't call them confrontations, let's just say visits, in the grocery store, in the park, and various other places. To establish this, I'm going to read you an excerpt from about 4 of these emails that again establish the intent. From the first email, my name is Heather Smith. I am currently a manager/project manager of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee. I have been employed by this organization for 7 years, 9 months, and as of November 4th, 2021, I will become another Tennessean unemployed due to my moral objections and personal choice not to receive the COVID-19 injection. I did submit a religious exemption request, which was accepted. However, the company has decided that the accommodation for me is for 30 days only, and as you know, not a true accommodation. It is merely an extension of the deadline. From a second email, I work for a large corporation. I have been at my company for 10 years this January. I am writing to respectfully ask you to support no forced mandate for vaccines. I have only until November 30th. I'm an RN, registered nurse, that does not work bedside. I work on the Medicaid side of a large insurance company. I mostly work from home 95% of the time. I have taken precautions and have not had COVID. I do not want the vaccine. The flu vaccine is not mandated, and flu kills tons of people, including kids. If you are vaccinated, why am I a threat? I know that the risk that I take daily by not getting the shot. It's a risk I take knowing COVID is in the 90% plus survival rate. Let me make my own decision and consider my own risk. If you are vaccinated, you will not be threatened by my decision. From yet another email. I am writing to you as I am deeply concerned and troubled by the extraordinary unconstitutional powers granted to unelected officials in our state. This is unacceptable as in a constitutional democratic republic, and I urge you to do everything possible to restore the power back to we, the people, and help rescind those powers permanently. As a first-generation immigrant from a South American nation, I have seen this playbook used and played out before in countries in Latin America to the demise of democracy in those nations. I urge you to do everything possible to correct this unacceptable situation and help to ensure it can never happen again. Please help defend our God-given individual rights and our state/federal constitutions. From yet another email. My daughter, a senior at the University of Memphis, is a geology major who will be losing her student employment at U of M because she will not comply and take the injection she does not want in her body. She is a 2-year employee of the U of M CSER, which is this acronym, Center for Applied Earth Sciences and Engineering Research, and returned 2 weeks ago from a project in Death Valley, California, which was fully funded by the program, and Olivia was hand-selected to join. We are very sad the university chose to send out this letter last Thursday, 10/21/21, citing the outrageous Biden-issued executive order 14042 to be vaxxed or terminated. This will impact Olivia's engagement in her area of study and prevent her from gaining gainful opportunities. Should not be the case. I could go on, ladies and gentlemen. I have many more of these examples. One from an AT&T employee who has had 24 years with the company and is going to be terminated. This is to establish, again, the legislative intent behind this piece of legislation. And in keeping with that, because we fully anticipate a court case, I'm going to have to read you word for word the resolution. I know all of you have seen it online. but this must be read into the record, both for public consumption, those that are here, as well as those that are online. Whereas on September 9th, 2021, the President of the United States announced an executive order that mandates COVID-19 vaccinations for employees of federal contractors and subcontractors. And whereas President Biden also announced the forthcoming Emergency Temporary Standard, ETS, to be issued on the by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration regarding COVID-19 vaccinations or routine testing for employers with more than 100 employees. And whereas part of the President's COVID-19 action plan includes having the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS, require COVID-19 vaccinations for workers in most healthcare settings that receive Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement, including hospitals, dialysis facilities, ambulatory surgical settings, and home healthcare agencies. And whereas the new CMS requirement will be in addition to the vaccination requirement for nursing facilities previously announced by CMS and will apply to nursing home staff as well as staff in hospitals and other CMS regulated settings, including clinical staff, individuals providing services under arrangements, volunteers, and staff who are not involved in direct patient, resident, or client care. And whereas federalism is described and analyzed in Bond versus the U.S. 564 U.S. 211 from 2011, in which the United States Supreme Court declared that the federal system rests on the insight that freedom is enhanced by the creation of two governments, not one. And whereas the court further stated that this freedom is enhanced first by protecting the integrity of the two governments themselves, and second by protecting the people from whom the government powers are derived. And whereas federalism serves to grant and delimit the prerogatives and responsibilities of the state and the national government vis-a-vis one another, and preserves integrity, dignity, and residual sovereignty of the states. Whereas this federal balance ensures that states function as political entities in their own right, and whereas by denying any one government complete jurisdictions over the concerns of public life, federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary power. When the government acts in excess of lawful powers, that liberty is at stake. And whereas the limitations prescribed under federalism are not a matter of rights belonging only to the states, states are not the sole intended beneficiaries of federalism. An individual has a direct interest in objecting to laws that upset the constitutional balances between the national governments and the states. Whereas the United States Supreme Court and National Federation of Independent Businesses, otherwise known as NFIB, versus Sebelius, Cite 567 U.S. 519 from 2012, further analyzed federalism and the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, as well as the taxing power of the federal government. And whereas the court acknowledged that a government's police power is the general power of governing possessed by the states, but not by the federal government, as the federal government possesses only enumerated powers listed in the U.S. Constitution. And whereas the Constitution's expressed conferral of some powers for federal government makes it clear that it does not grant others, and the federal government the federal government can exercise only the powers granted to it. And whereas independent power of the states serves as a check on the power of the federal government by denying any one government complete jurisdictions over all concerns of public life, federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary power. And whereas the federal government may create incentives for states to act in accordance with federal policies, but when the pressure turns to compulsion, it runs contrary to federalism, and the Constitution does not give the federal government the authority to require states to regulate, regardless of whether the federal government directly commands the state to regulate or indirectly coerces the state to adopt a federal regulatory system as its own. And whereas the assertions of federal authority must be grounded in some constitutional grant of power, with the most common basis for federal intervention in private affairs being the Constitution's Commerce Clause, which empowers Congress to regulate commerce among the several states. And whereas in NFIB versus Sebelius, the Supreme Court held the Commerce Clause cannot be used to compel individuals to engage in activity, even when such activity has an impact on interstate commerce. And whereas, while the compelled activity in NFIB was purchasing health insurance, the logic applies with equal force to a federal mandate to get an injection or submit to a weekly test, as foreshadowed by Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, when he rejected the interpretation of the Commerce Clause that would allow, for example, Congress to pass a law requiring individuals to buy vegetables to promote healthier eating habits. And whereas whereas it is Congress, not the executive branch, that is grounded the enumerated powers under Article 1, Section 8 to lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, and excises, to pay debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. And whereas the essential feature of any tax is that it produces at least some revenue for the government, and in distinguishing penalties from taxes, the general concept of a penalty means punishment for an unlawful act or omission. And whereas the federal government cannot change whether an exaction is a tax or a penalty for constitutional purposes simply by describing it as one or the other. And whereas the court and NFIB determined that the exaction of that the Patient Protection Act and Affordable Care Act imposed on those without health insurance through the Act's shared responsibility payment was a tax for the purpose of Congress's taxing power, though the Act described the exaction as a penalty rather than a tax, and the exaction was intended to affect individual conduct. And whereas requiring employees or employers in this state to pay for a COVID-19 test to comply with a federal mandate, including the forthcoming ETS to be issued by OSHA, such employees or employers will effectively be taxed by the executive branch and not an act of Congress, as is constitutionally required. Whereas reliance on the federal government on OSHA to implement a federal mandate represents an egregious overstepping of the authority that is granted to OSHA under the 1970 Occupational Safe and Healthy Act, Occupational Safe and Health Act, Safety and Health Act. I'll get there in a minute. As nothing in that law even hints at the sweeping powers the president has claimed. And whereas the Occupational Safety and Health Act's reference to substances or agents strongly suggests that OSHA's ETS power is meant to target workplace hazards like dangerous chemicals and not naturally occurring hazards like viruses. And whereas decisions regarding any vaccine mandate properly belong to the states, not the federal government, and the United States Supreme Court precedents on the validity of vaccine mandates under Jacobson versus Massachusetts, Site 197, U.S. 11 from 1905, and Zucht versus King, Site 260, U.S. 174 from 1922, involve state, not federal laws, and are part of the broad police powers enjoyed by the states. Whereas the announced executive orders and COVID-19 action plan are attempts by the federal government to coerce the state of Tennessee and its citizens in violation of both the United States Constitution and the Tennessee Constitution. And whereas each member of the General Assembly has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of Tennessee and the Constitution of the United States, and whereas if the federal government intends to overreach its authority to the point that it assumes the traditional constitutional role of a state legislative body, it is only fitting and proper that the very existence as well as the depth and breadth of this federal power be condemned and challenged, not just in a court of law, but also through the actions of the General Assembly to nullify such federal overreach. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives of the 112th General Assembly of the state of Tennessee, the Senate concurring, that the state of Tennessee condemns any attempts by federal government to penalize or tax citizens in this state in an effort to enforce an unconstitutional mandate regarding COVID-19 vaccinations or other COVID-related restrictions and requirements. Be it further resolved that this is the right of the Tennessee General Assembly to enact such legislation as deemed necessary to nullify actions taken by the federal government regarding COVID-19 when those actions violate the United States Constitution. Be it further resolved that the Tennessee General Assembly urges the Attorney General and Reporter of the state of Tennessee to initiate or intervene in one or more civil actions on behalf of the state of Tennessee, or in the alternative, seek appropriate relief in a federal court of competent jurisdiction regarding COVID-19 mandates issued by the federal government, and any action taken by the federal government, including the President of the United States, the head of a department or agency, or any other employee of the executive branch of the United States in violation of federal law, or as prohibited by the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, or any other statutory constitutional provisions of the United States or the state of Tennessee with respect to the implementation of enforcement in this state of any provision of the federal government's mandate that requires citizens of this state to either receive a COVID-19 vaccination or submit to routine testing. Be it further resolved that a certified copy of this resolution is transmitted to the Attorney General and Reporter of Tennessee. I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of the announcement I made earlier. This is a history-making resolution. I would remind you that you've got to look back.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I would remind you that you've got to look back to the 1830s when Andrew Jackson from the state of Tennessee was president. He announced that he was going to invade South Carolina over nullification. However, the federal government backed down in that case. So nullification is something that has been around. We're not plowing new ground, but we are plowing historic ground. With that, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I apologize for the length of the presentation, but I stand ready to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, do we have any questions for Chairman Reagan? Seeing none, are we ready to vote? Oh, excuse me. Oh, Chairman Zachary, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Reagan, as you typically do, thank you for standing for the Constitution. Thank you for standing for freedom. Thank you for standing for liberty. I think that's going to become a theme throughout the day. And you have been a passionate, ardent defender of that ever since I've been here. So thank you for leading that charge.
You're welcome.
Members, anyone else? And I want to echo that, Chairman Reagan. You're always dedicated to what you do, and we appreciate it. And the citizens of Tennessee, I know, do as well. So with that said, members, are we ready to vote? Looks like we are. Looks like we're voting to send House Joint Resolution 9005 to calendar and rules. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No. Ayes have it. Bill moves on. That brings us to item four. Item four, members and folks. House Bill 9033 by Representative Garrett. Do I have a motion in a second, members? You've got a motion and a second, and you're properly recognized.
Mr. Chairman, committee, thank you. I'll just turn my. Thank you very much. This committee's done such a great job. The previous legislation incorporated, if not all, of this legislation that I proposed for you and improved it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your work. I'd like the bill to be withdrawn.
Very good. Members, do we have any objection? Seeing none, House Bill 9033 is going to be withdrawn. Thank you. That's it. Correction. House Bill 9033 is to be taken off notice without objection. Thank you. All right. That brings us to item 8, House Bill 9051 by Chairman Reagan. Sir, you're right back where you were. You got a motion? Okay. And you got a second. You're probably recognized. It's 9051, sir. That's item 8, 9051.
Sir, I wish to take that one off notice in
Okay.
favor of House Bill 9053, which I think is the next one on the agenda.
Very good. And I may have announced that earlier and just didn't scratch it off my docket here. Okay, House Bill 9051, if I hadn't already said it, is taken off notice without objection. Thank you. That brings us to item 9, House Bill 9053. You've got a motion in a second, sir. You're
Thank you,
probably
members.
recognized.
As you can see, if you look at this bill, it's very simple. 5 lines. What it does is move forward slightly what we normally do in March of every session. In March, we passed the Bill Omnibus Act, which includes all of the rules that have been presented to government operations, except those that the Government Operations Committee has disapproved. In this particular case, an emergency rule was presented to us, which the committee overwhelmingly voted down, disapproved it. This bill simply takes that bill, which would be voted out in March anyway, and votes it out with this one. It says essentially, notwithstanding Title IV, Chapter 5, Part 2, the Department of Labor and Workforce Development, pardon me, I'm sorry, I should have given you context. This bill is related to TOSHA, Tennessee Occupational Health and Safety Act. They promulgated an emergency rule enacting the federal rule, which we just passed a resolution nullifying, but their emergency rule is still on the books. So what this bill does is repeal that rule so that our nullification resolution goes forward clean. In other words, we can't be attacked for having something on our books that is in violation or contradiction to our Nullification Act. And with that explanation, I stand ready to answer questions.
Very good. And thank you for that explanation. Members have any questions for Chairman Reagan? Leader Lambert. Thank you. Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, and to the sponsor, I had a quick question. Can we roll this 3 spaces?
Members have any objection? Mr.
No
Sponsor?
objection.
Very good. Roll 3 spaces. And that brings us to item 12. We got Chairman Sapicki, House Bill 9007. You've got a motion and you have a second, sir. You're probably recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, being a chairman on the Education Committee, we have been very concerned with contact tracing in our schools, taking our children out of the schools for long periods of academic teaching. But I'm very happy to report that school systems across the state have really gotten very creative on how to keep our children in our schools. And so we're very pleased with that right now. We hope that they will continue that to make sure that our children stay in our schools as much as possible, making sure that they're getting the time in front of our teachers. Mr. Chairman, this time I'm going to withdraw this bill.
And thank you for that. Thank you for that. So without objection, House Bill 9007 has been taken off notice by the sponsor. That brings us to item 13, House Bill 9017. Representative Rudd. Is he here? Okay, members, I don't see Representative Rudd here right now, so we're going to roll item 13, House Bill 9017, 22 spaces. 22 spaces without objection. And also item 14, that is also Representative Rudd's bill, House Bill 9052. We're also going to roll that bill 22 spaces without objection. Thank you. That brings us to item 17, House Bill 9025 by Chair Lady Moody. Chair Lady Moody. I don't see her. So House Bill 9025, I'm also going to roll without objection that bill 22 spaces. That brings us to item 18, House Bill 9003 by Representative Halsey. You got a motion and a second, sir. You're probably recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Due to the fact that we have passed a couple of other bills that covered the same thing that 9003 covered, I'm asking to withdraw that bill.
Members, you heard the request and the objection. So without objection, we're going to take House Bill item 18, House Bill 9003 off of notice. Without objection. Thank you. Now we're going to go back to item 9, Chairman Reagan. Back to item 9, Chairman Reagan's House Bill 953. Second.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
in order to get further input, I'd ask for another 3 spaces of roll.
An additional 3 spaces?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And without objection, members, we're going to roll item 9. Well, I guess technically it would have been, well, we're going to roll that item, which would have been 19, an additional 3 spaces. Without objection. All right, item 19, House Bill 9023 by Representative Halsey. You got a motion in a second. You're probably recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is called the Healthcare Liberty Jurisdiction Act, and the purpose of the bill is to create a conflict between the jurisdictional claims of the federal government versus those of state government over day-to-day affairs of Tennessee residents relative to their fundamental rights at common law to personal security and to liberty, and that were retained by the people under the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution. Now, if you've got the bill before you, you'll notice several pages of whereas clauses. And those whereas clauses, I asked legal to put those in there because you can see that they recite the basis upon which the state legislature has constitutional authority to enact its provisions, even in the face of any federal mandate. Now, I'll go by sections. Section 1 and 2 enact the Healthcare Liberty Jurisdiction Act, and Section 2 sets forth legislative findings drawn from those whereas clauses that justify the claim of the state to constitutional jurisdiction. In other words, the issue is the federal government under the 10th Amendment does not have jurisdiction over issues dealing with health and health procedures and health medicine and those kinds of things. Those are left up to the powers of the state, which means that the federal government's got its own garden to hoe in. Tennessee has our garden to hoe in. They don't need to be hoeing in our garden. That's what this says. It gives us constitutional jurisdiction to protect the fundamental rights at common law of personal security and liberty. Now, as you know, the Ninth Amendment deals with common law rights, and most of you know that common law rights were in effect before the Constitution was ever written. Those rights are retained by the people. Some of them are enumerated in the Constitution, but that's why the Ninth Amendment's there, is to say that the people retain all those rights for personal security and for personal liberty. So it's on that basis that this bill provides that no person shall be required to submit or consent to or receive one of the currently offered COVID-19 shots. The protection of the person applies regardless of the justification given for the requirement. So what we're doing here, the rationale is you have a federal mandate for a COVID-19 shot that's imposed on employers, not in federal contractors, not directly on persons. Well, that mandate might or might not be within the federal government's jurisdiction. I don't know. But state law cannot override a valid federal law. But as Mr. Reagan pointed out, Representative Reagan, valid. The 10th Amendment Constitution says it's not valid. Thus, the act has this legislature, our body, exercise its constitutional powers to protect the lives and liberty of persons in this state in accordance with the 9th and 10th Amendments, to give the person who is so employed or who works for a federal contractor the right to refuse to take the shot. Now, if we put that in code in this law, this creates a conflict between the jurisdictional claims of the federal government versus those of state government over the day-to-day affairs of individual persons residing in Tennessee relative to their fundamental rights at common law for personal security and personal liberty. But that's what we want. These provisions should invite a lawsuit by the federal government, either through the Department of Justice or OSHA. Because now, if we enact this bill, state law is allowing persons not to do what the federal mandate requires employees and contractors to do with respect to those persons. So if we enact this bill, it should allow employers a defense against any federal action for enforcement for COVID-19 shots, because the employee is given a right to refuse by state law. That means that the employer does not have a right to violate an employee's state fundamental rights based on the 9th Amendment to the Constitution. Moreover, the right of the individual who's employed to refuse treatment should allow a business to bring a lawsuit for declaration of whether federal law can require an employee to give up rights. In section 3, this section adds two provisions that list prohibited things, two of them, under the Tennessee Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The first one prohibits any person from suggesting to another person that they are required by a rule or a regulation or policy of the federal government to submit to or consent to receive a COVID-19 shot. This is consistent with this legislature's claim that the federal government has no direct constitutional authority to require any person to submit to any medical procedure. The second prohibition is a prohibition saying that a manufacture, sale, or delivery, or holding or offering for sale of a COVID-19 drug, if it's advertised as a vaccine, that is prohibited unless this shot protects a person from being infected. A vaccine, by whose definition? The World Health Organization, and also by the CDC's definition, a vaccine is a substance that causes an immunity to build in a person's body to when they come in contact with the disease, they do not catch it. This COVID-19 shot is not a vaccine. Doctors in my turf say that 60% of people who are testing positive now are vaccinated people. It does not prevent the disease. It might mitigate some of the effects, but it does not prevent the disease. So the second prohibition is you can't advertise it or sell it or talk about it as if it's a vaccine. It is not. Of course, this provision creates a conflict of the powers of Congress to regulate commerce among the states, but in agreement with Representative Reagan, that's not an issue here. The fourth section adds teeth to the provision because when it comes to an employer requiring this shot by stating that the limitations of liability under the workers' compensation laws will not apply if this employee is harmed by it, which is also in another bill that we just passed. The last section amends the sections of the code that govern malpractice actions against healthcare providers. It protects a patient by stating that informed consent is not obtained if the guy going to get the shot, the doctor knows or believes or should know that he's there because he's being coerced or required to from an employer to get a shot. That is not informed consent. Consent is voluntary, not coerced. And also, the healthcare provider, if he portrays this shot as being a vaccine, then that eliminates his protection from damages. So at the end of the day, the 10th Amendment does not give the federal government right to meddle in health practices in the state of Tennessee. That's our job. So we have to decide in the Senate and in this House whether we're going to bow the knee to Bail in Washington or we're going to stand up for Tennessee people. That's what it is. So that's my bill.
All right, thank you, Representative Halsey. I was talking to legal here, and we may have an issue that could affect something that's important to a lot of working people here in Tennessee. So I'm going to recognize our legal staff here to, if you would introduce yourself and let folks know what's going on.
Rajul Bajoy, Office of Legal Services. From my understanding, Section 4 of this bill, which amends Tennessee Code Annotated Section 56103, which is the workers' compensation law, the amendment would say that this chapter, as in the workers' compensation law, does not apply to an injury to or an economic loss suffered by any employee resulting from a subcutaneous injection of one or more drugs related to COVID-19. That would prohibit an employee from recovering damages from their employer under the workers' compensation law.
That's one of the members to be aware of that one potential issue there. Leader Lambert, you're recognized, and I'll get back to you, bud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And really probably three questions for the sponsor. One, is it your intention, with the other bill that we've already passed out, to go forward on this bill today?
Representative Halsey, you recognize, sir.
It is, because particularly with section 1 and 2, it provides the constitutional fundamental basis that gives us a right to do everything else we want to do in these other bills.
Leader Lambert, you recognize, sir.
And thank you. That's the reason I wanted to, before I ask a couple of detailed questions. So in reviewing the language of the bill, and I don't know if this was the intention or not, and I apologize, I did not know you were going forward in this bill, or I would have asked you before the committee. But in several sections here, it references subcutaneous injections and the World Health Organization, and seems to yield, and I know this was not your intent, or at least I'm assuming, but it seems to yield quite a bit of authority to the World Health Organization on what the definitional aspects of this bill are. So what we're prohibiting here seems to be controlled very much by an entity that is well beyond our purview. I would have preferred in the bill, and I haven't had a chance to amend or anything else, I'm just bringing it up as an issue to get your thoughts. I would have preferred that we had a very specific definition, like we did in the bill that passed out of this committee already, defining COVID-19 vaccine, defining it very broadly, regardless of whether or not it's a subcutaneous injection or it's designated by the World Health Organization. They're just, your thoughts on that to the sponsor, sir.
Chairman Halsey, you recognize.
The purpose was for the writing, and the verbiage that it's used is to be consistent, that this shot is not a vaccine, and by their own definition, it's not a vaccine. So subcutaneous is another word to say shot, to stay away from using the word vaccine.
Excuse me, Leader Lambert, you recognize, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the sponsor, I mean, it was my understanding that you wanted to have this encompass the entire kind of realm of COVID-19 vaccine. And if, there are many vaccines that are given orally through other methods that do not have to be a subcutaneous shot. And then also, again, this kind of joins us to whatever the World Health Organization defines it as. If they shift their definition, it would invalidate this bill. I don't think that's your intention. That's the reason I'm asking why the language specifically of this, because it seems like it would give the World Health Organization the ability to just shift their language, and all of a sudden this bill wouldn't apply to it.
Chairman Halsey, you recognize, sir.
I understand that. It makes sense. We're at this point using the definition that the World Health Organization and the CDC has actually had for years. That is the definition they use and have been using. And I don't know how to deal with that if they change their definition.
Leader Lambert, any follow-up, sir?
The only thing I would recommend, and again, I realize that this, is not something that can be amended at this exact juncture, but in the other bill that had already passed this committee, one of the reasons, many reasons why I supported that bill, and I support the purpose of this bill in which you brought, but the other bill had a much broader definition for COVID-19 vaccine, and it wasn't linked to what other entities had defined it as. So I prefer terms to be defined just within the statute. I don't have a specific, it would take a significant amendment in this bill to go through and remove all of that and include the broader definition. I just wanted to bring it up as a point because legally speaking, I think it creates some potential weaknesses here in a bill that I agree 100% with your desired impact of the bill. It's just the language of it that I think has a few issues. That's just my only point.
Okay. Chairman Halsey, any follow-up to that, sir?
No, sir.
All right. Chairman Todd, you recognize, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Halsey, I appreciate you bringing this legislation, and it does bring a lot of clarity to the stance that many of us have with regard to the position of the federal government and state governments. I would remind my fellow business owners that would be watching this and listening to this that under the law, a business is a person and enjoys many of the rights that individuals do, being a person under the law. With that, though, comes responsibilities. I don't think there's anybody in this room that would walk over to one of their friends or neighbors or their church members and say, I'm going to require you to put something in your arm, a chemical in your arm, because it makes me feel better. That's ludicrous. No one would expect that, but that's exactly what many in the business community are doing right now, is saying, because I think it's the right thing to do, for whatever reason, you get to put this in your arm or lose your job. And so, Chairman Halsey, I appreciate you bringing this, and I fully support this. And certainly, if there's a way to make it better, I would be all for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Members, any additional questions or follow-up for Chairman Halsey on this? Are we ready to vote? Oh, excuse me, Chairman Howell, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the sponsor, thank you for the bill. More of a comment than anything. The CDC's own data estimates that 50% of the U.S. population enjoys natural COVID immunity. I have family members who unfortunately suffered with COVID, some of them quite drastically. Fortunately, they survived, but they enjoy now a natural immunity, which the CDC says is better than a vaccine.
25 times.
Why then is the Biden administration insistent that everyone must be vaccinated when 50% of the population enjoys something better than the vaccination? I think the intent of your bill is outstanding. I support your bill, and if you can find a way to address the leader's concerns, it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, to the sponsor, and we're all, I said kind of at the beginning, I hope we take our time on all these bills because I want to make sure that everything that is filed both matches the intent of the sponsor of the legislation and that, of the committee. Section 4, what legal mentioned earlier, and I want to see what your intent is to see whether or not there's any changes that are needed. But in taking this out of the workers' comp section of the code, what in essence, I think I understand that would do is that any employee just has a cause of action against the employer instead of going through the workers' comp process that they would normally go through now. Was it your intention to make sure that they would be eligible for workers' comp or that they would not be and they would just have a lawsuit?
All right, Chairman Halsey, you recognized.
And thank you. The intent is to keep workman's comp and be able to have it along with tort liability if they need it. The reason I have a question about that is because the amendment into this section, I think, removes the liability protection that would normally fall and grants workers compensation or tort liability. That was my understanding.
Leader Lambert, you recognize, sir.
Mr. Chairman, can we go to legal for that? Because that's exactly what I think we're both trying to figure out is, does this remove the ability for an employee to get workers' comp or does it still allow that to occur?
All right, and we'll do that. Members, if our, Mr. Bejoy, if you'll go ahead and if you'd address that for us, sir. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to go ahead and go out of session and do that. So without objection.
Rajul Bejoy, Office of Legal Services. So from my understanding, if the sponsor's intent is to have workers' comp available to employees that are injured from the injection, then the section should read, this chapter applies to any injury or economic loss suffered. Since it currently reads, this chapter does not apply, it exempts those claims from workers' compensation. So employees that suffer an injury, as described in this section, would not be able to recover workers' compensation.
Members, any questions for legal while we're out of session? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go back into session without objection. Excuse me. Chairman Todd, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Wasn't as quick on the draw as you wanted me to be, I guess. I guess one clarification. So if they're not eligible for work comp, then what?
Mr. Bejoy?
So then they would have to sue through the court system. So workers' compensation is a strict liability. It doesn't look to see if there's negligence on the employer. It just covers the injury. But if this chapter didn't apply, then they would have to sue through the court system, prove negligence, bring a tort action. That's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. And is there any, also just kind of following up on that question too, legal, is there any, so if this legislation passes, that we're outside of the workers' compensation system, we're into statute, we're into our normal remedies of tort. Is there also an issue of immunity as well there?
So under current law, Title 29 actually would actually prohibits and provides immunity to businesses for injuries that result from anything relating to COVID-19. It exempts workers' compensation claims entirely, but that immunity would apply in this case if this law was passed or if this legislation was passed.
Okay. Leader Lambert, you're recognized. Thank you.
And I absolutely can guess, because he's a dear friend of mine, that there's no way that the sponsor intended to block a employee from workers' comp and at the exact same time allow the business to be shielded from a lawsuit because of another bill that we passed last year. But it's from what you're describing, the language of this bill would both block an employee from pursuing a workers' comp claim and, because of a separate statute, prevent them from suing the business. So in other words, give the business a complete and total shield against liability. Is that my understanding?
Mr. Bejoy?
Yes, sir, that would be correct.
All right, members, any other questions for Mr. Bejoy while we're out of session? All right, seeing none, we're going to go back into session without objection. All right, we're back into session. Members, any questions or comments? Representative Halsey, you recognize, sir.
Yeah, as I understood it, the bill we passed last year was to protect a business. If somebody walked in there to do business in their business, and a week later they said, I caught COVID at your business when I went in there, it was that kind of liability that we were protecting. It's not liability that comes as a result of a forced injection that somebody takes. That bill should not cover these kinds of issues that I'm talking about. And that's my intent, is to be able to provide tort liability if that happens, and also have workman's comp protection. That's the way I thought it fit into this code. Was it gave liability, except in this case you don't have liability protection. Was my intent.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's the reason I wanted to ask these questions, because I want to make sure your intent, what you were trying to do, gets on the record, even though the language of it appears not to go that direction. Is it possible that at this time, I mean, I don't know how you want to proceed, but I want to support you in it, because again, the purpose of what you're trying to do here, I think many of us in this room support. Is it possible to, take this off notice and add the thoughts that were in this bill onto another bill that may already be moving? I mean, I don't think this committee will be meeting again, but it might be, or take this up another time. The issue that I have is that I don't want a worker, and I don't think you do, to be barred from being able to bring something. But unfortunately, it sounds like the language does. And I'm not comfortable with that.
Chairman Halsey.
Mr. Chairman, do I have time to go get an amendment to repair this one section? I don't want to lose the whole bill over this right here.
We have, we could roll this. Okay, members. If we could, without objection, roll Representative Halsey's bill 16 spaces. 16 spaces. That should give you some time, sir, to work a little bit on that and see if you can tidy that up, okay? All right, so without objection. Thank you. And I had, for those out there in the audience and members as well, I had forgot to announce the items 15 and 16 by Chairman Doggett. House Bill 9009 and 9010 will be taken off notice at the request of the sponsor. So without objection, those bills will be taken off notice. I believe that brings us to item 21, House Bill 9012 by Representative Ogles. You've got a motion? You've got a second. You can, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Take a seat there, Mr. Representative. And you've got a motion and a second. You're properly recognized, sir.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Chairman, members of committee. Chairman, this bill does something that we've talked about all day, and it's actually puts a definition to something that's being debated right now. All over the state of Tennessee, there's people that are claiming religious exemptions, yet we have not put anything in the code that defines what that is. So with that, we're having to take federal rulings, the opinions of federal judges, and opinions out of Washington to decide what a religious exemption in the state of Tennessee means. Chairman, I filed the amendment coded 010242.
And that's what I have in front of me. Does that make the bill?
Yes, sir. That
Okay.
rewrites and makes the
You've got a
bill.
motion, and do I have a second? And you have a second. Okay, so got a motion and a second on the amendment, and have you explained that yet? I apologize. I've had a little bit
No,
going
sir.
on here.
I'll go back to it, and I'll read this for the committee.
Thank you. So we're on the amendment.
So this does two things. It basically says if somebody requires a COVID-19 vaccination, they must honor and give provide a religious exemption. And once they do that, it says if a person or entity requires an individual to receive a COVID-19 vaccination or to proof of having received a COVID-19 vaccination, the person or entity must provide an exemption to the requirement for an individual with a religious exemption. The religious exemption must include any individual who is a member of a recognized religious group, denomination, or division, and it is adherent to established tenets or teachers of such group, denomination, or division, by reason of which the individual is conscientiously opposes to receive a COVID-19 vaccination. And with that, Chairman, I respect our judges, local judges, and our federal judges. However, I have much greater respect for the members of this General Assembly and the members of this committee and their opinions. This is very much within the privy of this body, and I would much rather see us define what that means rather than have a discombobulated system. Right now in the state of Tennessee, there's actually questionnaires being distributed to employees where CEOs and boards are asking people to prove what their religious grounds for not taking the vaccination are. And I think the General Assembly needs to define what that means. With that, Chairman, I'll rest and take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, members, and just as procedural posture update here, we're on the amendment. The amendment makes the bill. Does anyone have any questions on this? Any questions? You want to go ahead and adopt it? All right. No questions for Chairman Ogles? All right. All right, members, all those in favor of adopting House Amendment 10242 to House Bill 9012, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Ayes have it. Now we're back on the bill as amended. Members, any questions or comments for Representative Ogles? Okay. Chairman Howe.
Just a question. I missed part of I got distracted. Could you read the definition, religious exemption definition again for the committee?
Yes, sir. The religious exemption must include an individual who is a member of a recognized religious group, denomination, or division, and is an adherent of established tenets or teachers of such group, denomination, or division, by reason of which the individual is conscientiously opposed to receiving a COVID-19 vaccination. And with that, I would like to expand. There's many people within my, I would say, well, just across Tennessee that have reached out to us, and you've heard from them. In judiciary, we have a term of fruit of the poisonous tree. That basically means evidence that has been obtained illegally, therefore it's tainted and it's not admissible. I've heard over and over and over again from people that don't want a second or third generation of something that was derived, say, from a aborted fetal cell, and they say, I don't want that in my body. But yet we had members of even our own state health department and my district shaming people and saying, you don't have a valid religious exemption because you're not Pennsylvania, Dutch, Amish. That's not right. It's not their place to decide who has an exemption or not. If your religious objection and you're conscientiously opposed to something based on how you've been raised and how you feel about something, it's not for the state to come in and say, we don't recognize that. So that's why I think it's very important that we define this.
All right. And I just want, here was my understanding of where we are as of earlier today with regards to the legislation that Chairman Zachary was moving. That basically we said, look, you can't ask for documentation of an immunization of this vaccine, right? Can't ask for it. So what would be the point of having an exemption when you can't ask for it to begin with? I'm kind of thinking that's kind of how we went around to do that, because as of right now, as I understand it, religious exemption is from a state level really determined by a court in a lawsuit. I think it's determined in a very broad way, extraordinarily broad way, right? So if we go and we reduce that broad discretionary way that the courts typically handle it here in Tennessee, and we reduce it into about 10 words on a piece of paper, then are we restricting the determination of our religious beliefs for really no reason, because businesses and venues and such can't ask for documentation of immunization to the COVID-19?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. And you may have to refresh my memory, but I thought with that legislation, there were severability clauses. What I'm afraid of is if part of that legislation does not stand, or the entirety of it does not stand and is kicked out by a judge, we have nothing to fall back on in the state of Tennessee. So what we'll be left with is what we have now as a discombobulated system where people simply, where different companies and organizations or municipalities or universities. I've got several letters from college students that say their state university is not honoring religious exemptions. What do we fall back on? We have not defined it. If this definition, I talked to legal, I think this is a very, very broad definition and should cover everybody. I don't think we want to make it so broad that any preference on what meal plan you're on is considered a religious exemption, but I believe the definition is very broad, and that's the intent of the legislation.
All right, I apologize about that. Representative Ogles, if I interrupted you, then go ahead. Or if I need to, where was I, Robbie? All right, Representative Ogles, you recognize, sir. And we're on the bill as amended.
Chairman, I'm good. I was just waiting for you to clarify the
Well,
question.
I think the bill, the legislation we passed earlier that Chairman Zachary carried covers this issue, in my opinion. but you want to go a step further and rifle shot it with the religious exemption, I believe, it's looking like to me, but you recognize.
Well, Chairman, it makes the statement, but it does not in any way define what that means.
Okay.
And that's what we've had for the last year. That's what we've dealt with. That's what our constituents are dealing with. And I think this needs to be clarified. And if members of this committee, I'm willing to roll this if they see something in the language they would like to be firmed up. But I would hope the General Assembly would take upon itself to define something that's so important.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Todd, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would request that we go out of session and ask legal a question that I have about this.
Members, any objection to going out of session? Seeing none. All right, you recognize. Oh, I'm sorry. Question first, and then the answer comes next. It's like
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the clarification on
my
that.
fault.
I thought we were under a different set of
I
rules.
was telling myself that. Really.
No problem, sir. So I'm wondering if this sets any precedent in the law related to other sections that deal with religious exemptions or expands religious exemption as described here, which is only for COVID-19 as I read it. Does it go beyond COVID-19 or can it set a precedent that would go beyond COVID-19?
So this language, and I'll read out the text itself, says the religious exemption must include any individual who's a member of a recognized religious group, denomination, or division, and is an adherent of established tenets or teachers of such group, denomination, or division, by reason of which the individual is conscientiously opposed to receiving a COVID-19 vaccine. So the language must includes just specifies that a religious exemption includes what I just said. It doesn't specifically define religious exemption. It defines what one example of a religious exemption is. So it leaves it open still. So a religious exemption, if it's used in another context outside of COVID-19, could still have a definition that has been set by the courts.
Chairman Todd.
Thank you, sir. So, the last part of what you read is in talking about the religious sects, by reason of which the individual is conscientiously opposed to receiving a COVID-19 vaccination. So it sounds like this exemption is only related to COVID-19 and would not extend to some other aspect of employment, let's say, in the law. Would that be a correct statement?
You recognize.
Sir, could you restate that again for my understanding?
Certainly. So the way I read this is that the exemption is tied to a religious sect, let's say, of which the individual is conscientiously opposed to receiving a COVID-19 vaccination. So it seems like it ties this exemption only to COVID-19 and could not be extrapolated anywhere else in the law for a religious exemption against other things. Would that be accurate?
So it only applies in the context of this section. And again, with the must includes language, it's just specifying that this definition applies or is one example of a religious exemption. But again, it's only for this section.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to make that statement when we go back in session for the record.
You're welcome. Thank you for those questions. Leader Lamberth, any questions for legal?
Yes, just one. Hey, Mr. Chairman, I think he's engaged with another member at the time. That's fine.
And thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for leading us so admirably today.
Leader, if you would, just go ahead and repeat your question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the question is, if we were to attempt to amend this so that religious exemption would cover a broader spectrum than COVID-19, would that fall outside of the call of the special called session? Would we be able to actually go beyond that or not? Or is that potentially a question for the clerk?
say the clerk would be best equipped to handle that.
You're a very able and capable attorney. That's an excellent answer.
Yep.
So,
Do we? Okay. All right. Any other questions for legal while we're out of session? All right. Seeing none. I'll gap us back into session. All right. We're back in session, back on the bill as amended. Chairman Howe, you recognize? Then I'll get you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For clarity to the sponsor, is it, as I understand the bill that we passed previously, an employer is not prohibited from requiring, requiring a vaccine of its employees, but the bill does prohibit them from asking for documentation. Is that correct? Is the way I understand it? Can someone help me here?
Yeah, as I understand the legislation we passed earlier, it does preclude any business entity in a venue of that sort from asking for that verification, that
Okay.
documentation. Yes.
So my question, is it your intent then, should that part of the bill be challenged in court and be struck down? You're wanting this to be like a safety net for the employees?
Representative Ogles, you recognize.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. It's my intent that this is just an additional safeguard. This in no way is intended to conflict with other legislation. It's simply to define something and give more protection to those individuals that I believe are being discriminated against across this state.
President Howe, you good? Todd?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the sponsor, I would just want to clarify what we heard when we were out of session with legal. And their interpretation of this is that this religious exemption that's described here, which I think is very good description, and I support this, but that it only applies to the situation related to a COVID-19 vaccine and does not expand any kind of religious exemption or apply to any religious exemption anywhere else in the code. Is that your intention?
Representative Ogles, you recognize.
I'm checking the language. The last three words, the last 5 words, conscientiously opposed to receiving a COVID-19 vaccination. So I will agree that this is specific to vaccination, forced vaccination requirements. So yes.
Okay.
All right,
Thank you,
very
Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to clarify that for 2 reasons. One, to make sure that it is, stays within the call. And this is only dealing with COVID-19 and doesn't apply anywhere else in the law. Therefore, we wouldn't be debating anywhere else in the law. But also, I don't want to weaken religious exemption somewhere else either. I want to make sure that that exemption stays strong in our law. And that's been a concern that's been expressed. And we want to make sure we preserve that and even the right of conscience. So thank you for this.
Very good. Representative Ogles, any follow-up?
Yes, Chairman, and to the representative, this legislation in no way is to weaken religious exemption. It's more to strengthen it and actually give it some teeth and give our citizens something to stand on. Because I don't believe in any way that businesses should be objectively defining what that is and mandating that on their employees. So thank you for that question.
Very good. Representative Grills, Vice Chair Grills, you're next on the list. You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we're discussing this back and forth about religious exemptions and what it would encompass, whether this special session here would just encompass this or the whole TCA. But Article 1, Section 3 of the Tennessee Constitution, I'm going to read it verbatim, that all men have a natural and indefensible right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own conscience, that no man can of right be compelled to attend, erect, or support any place of worship or to maintain any minister against his consent, that no human authority can in any case whatever control or interfere with the rights of conscience, and that no preferences shall be given by law to any religious establishment or mode of worship. I believe we already have those rights of conscience. I believe we already have that in our Constitution, enshrined in our Constitution. Maybe the courts don't necessarily recognize it, but I believe our founders did. And if we could get back to those standings, to the original intent, we wouldn't be in this case that we're in now, trying to protect our citizenry from an overreaching government or populace. Thank you.
All right, members, any other questions for this, for the sponsor? Oh, Representative Ogles, you recognized.
I was just going to comment, say well said, and it's a shame that we're even having to discuss this today. So thank you for saying that.
Very good. Seeing no more questions or comments, we're going to take a 5-minute recess without objection.
That means I'm in trouble. Recess is not good. Uh-oh.
And thanks everyone for your patience once again. It's the theme of the day. We're working hard to get things right. Members and folks in the audience, we were debating item 21, House Bill 9012. Representative Ogles, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. After further studying and talking to representation, we have previous legislation that we've passed that I think firms this up for now pretty well. There's a broader definition, another piece of legislation that defines a religious exemption as a person sincerely held religious beliefs. So with that, I think this legislation is covered for now. But just realize that if we have a problem going forward in the state, that I hope that we would quickly revisit this and take this up, because we definitely don't need corporations or entities or school districts or universities challenging somebody's religious beliefs and discriminating against them based on that. So with that, Chairman, I would request to take this off notice.
Very good, members. You heard the request. Any objection? Seeing none. House Bill 9012 is off notice. Brings us to item 22, House Bill 9013 by Representative Ogles.
Thank you, Chairman, members of committee. This piece of legislation deals with what we know as the mature minor doctrine, and a previous piece of legislation also took this up and dealt with this. And I'm appreciative for the speaker for hearing from so many of us as well as our constituents, and putting a piece of legislation out that firms up a parent's right to the medical procedures for their children. We appreciate our doctors greatly and our medical providers, although any injection or treatment given to a minor should always have parental consent. So with that, Chairman, I ask to take this off notice as well.
Very good. Members, any objection? Seeing none. Upon request of the sponsor, House Bill 9013 by Representative Ogles is off notice. Very good. And as I understand it, Representative Ogles, you'd like to also take item 23, House Bill 9055 off of notice?
Yes, Chairman. I think this is addressed as well in other legislation, so I think we're covered.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Upon your request, members, any objection? Seeing none. House Bill 9055 is off notice. That brings us back to item 9 by Chairman Reagan. Item 9, Chairman Reagan. I know we've been working on that. You got a motion. You got a second, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. The initial explanation I gave you hasn't changed. This is still only a 4-line bill. And the getting it out of this committee, I am planning on making sure it's harmonized with the bill that was passed earlier. If in fact it is, it will sit in finance. So if I can get it out of here, we'll park it after additional examination of the other bill. If not, I'll go forward with it. But based on the explanation that's been given to me, it looks like I'll be content to let it sit in finance and we get it out of here.
Very good. Members, any questions? Motion on the bill? Questions have been called on the bill? Any objection? Seeing none, ready to vote. All those in favor of sending House Bill 9053 to finance, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No. Ayes have it. Bill moves on to finance. That brings us back to item 24. Item 24. Oh, you're recognized, Chairman Faison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, I make a motion, we adjourn.
Very good. Members, the motion is proper motion. Seeing it properly seconded. Committee is adjourned to the call of the chair without objection.